Welcome. I'm Brenda Quenville. I'm a social worker with Centered Fire Counseling and Consulting, and I'm the co-lead of NORAD. NORAD is a research collective who has been researching human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation across Northeastern Ontario for the last 6 years. We wanted to take this opportunity to share with you a little bit about what we have learned, what you can do to help prevent human trafficking, and what you can do to help those who have those experiences. We do want to make it really clear from the outset that we do not see human trafficking as being the same as sex work. In fact, we will explain more in a moment, how mixing these two together creates more problems. Instead, we see human trafficking as exploitation, coercion, and even violence within the sex trade. We are the Northeastern Ontario Research Alliance on Human Trafficking, or NORAD. Our work is primarily located on Robertson Huron Treaty Territory, and the land that we gather on is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, specifically the Nipissing First Nation. Our home base is North Bay, Ontario, but our research takes place across Northeastern Ontario, across Anishinaabe and Mushkegowuk territories. NORAD is a research partnership between Nipissing University, the Union of Ontario Indians, Anishinaabe First Nation, Victim Services of Nipissing, and Centered Fire Counseling and Consulting. We thank our past partners, the AIDS Committee of North Bay and Area, and Amelia Rising Sexual Assault Center of Nipissing for their past contributions. Our research was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council from 2013 to 2020. We worked together with community-based practitioners and persons with lived experience to determine the gaps in services in our region and to build awareness about how to best support persons who have experienced human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Our work is guided according to Anishinaabe knowledge and traditional practices by Elder Donna DeBasage, Anishinaabe Kwe of the Fish Clan from Minomissing, Manitoulin Island. We wanted to share some of our findings with you, the general public, so that you may be inspired to take steps to both prevent human trafficking as well as to appropriately support people and organizations doing this work. All of our work through NORAD has been directed to service providers and policymakers who are working to support people who have experienced trafficking. Yet we recognize that human trafficking is a topic of concern for a wide variety of people, and that's why we created this webinar. We've also found that there's some misconceptions that we might be able to help sort out, and we also wanted to share our thoughts on who are at risk and why, and the things that you could do if you wanted to help. So first, what is human trafficking? One of the main challenges with understanding and responding to human trafficking is that it's actually not so easy to define. Though the Criminal Code of Canada defines human trafficking as the recruiting, transporting, transferring, receiving, holding, concealing, or harboring of a person, or exercising control, direction, or influence over the movements of a person for the purpose of exploiting them or facilitating their exploitation. But in our research, it quickly became evident that the way that people defined and described their own experience of human trafficking and exploitation did not neatly align with the Criminal Code definition. Instead, we heard time and again, people describe their experience primarily as unhealthy relationships and may even minimize the role that any violence or coercion that they experienced. The differences between the way that service providers, including police, social service organizations, and self-involved laypersons, define human trafficking and the persons with lived experience define their own experience seems to create frustration and harm for those who want to be helped. Imagine that you sought help for a particular issue with your partner who you love, and you're told that he's exploiting you and that you need to get away from him. It would create a rift between you and the service provider right away. A name and definition that we found more helpful came from conversations with the Sex Workers Advocacy Network of Sudbury, or SWANS, who called human trafficking rape trafficking, which highlights the presence of coercion and the absence of consent. Our group, NORAD, takes a critical anti-human trafficking approach, and we recognize that although human trafficking may play out in the commercial sex industry, it is different from consensual, non-coercive sex work. For example, if a person is manipulated, forced, or coerced into sex work and exposed to violence, they may be trafficked. However, not everyone who works in sex work is trafficked. Ultimately, we advocate for the person who has the lived experience to define their own experience, and that we work to create a meaningful relationship from there, supporting them in the way that they see fit. There are two important dimensions of human trafficking that we want you to know about. There's structural or systemic dimension and interpersonal dimensions. Individual experiences are inseparable from the structural roots of human trafficking. We mustn't underestimate the influence of structural or system-level violence as a part of human trafficking. Human trafficking exists because of gender-based violence, rape culture and misogyny, systemic racism and oppression, genocide, an ongoing issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, men, boys, and two-spirit persons, settler colonialism expressed through laws and policies, poverty, and social economic inequality. This is really important, and we want to share that we heard more than one example of trafficked women and family members reaching out, asking for help, who did not receive it. It was up to sex worker peers and allies and aunties and the informal community supports to get them out. We also heard examples of and concerns of discrimination and racism within formal service provider organizations across Northeastern Ontario. We see this as directly linked to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit persons, and particularly when help to exit is explicitly requested but denied. Addressing colonization and racism within our systems of care and communities is critically important in anti-human trafficking work in Northeastern Ontario. If a person goes to an organization for help and are met with overt or covert discrimination, they could be out of options. We don't live in a resource-rich area where there's a choice between service options. In this way, the stakes are very high in Northeastern Ontario. There are ways that we can begin to dismantle structural issues of, that influence human trafficking. Learn more about decolonization, reconciliation, and support Indigenous cultures within your area. Stand up to racism and encourage others to do the same. Vote for government officials who support social programming. Press for government to implement the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and the National Inquiry on Missing and Murders Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Persons. Fundraise for a pot of discretionary funds for use for the complex needs of people exposed to violence, coercion, and exploitation in sex work, including human trafficking. Support the work and messaging of your local sexual assault center, domestic violence centers, and Indigenous-led organizations. Our research shows that many people who experience trafficking were people who, in their youth or adolescence, felt disconnected or like they didn't belong in their communities. Some examples might include people who have experienced intergenerational and/or past trauma, childhood abuse and poverty, involvement with child protection services. Maybe they have mental health and addictions challenges. Basically, anyone with an unmet need for desire and belonging and being valued. It is exactly that gap, the human need for belonging and connection, that traffickers identify and exploit. We heard how traffickers present with opportunities to belong, to be needed, to be important to someone. As time progresses and the relationship deepens, traffickers will often present involvement in the sex industry as an opportunity to contribute to the relationship and to belonging. So foster inclusion. Volunteer or donate to groups that promote inclusion for youth. Support arts and culturally diverse programming as much as sports so that all can belong somewhere. Support harm reduction approaches for youth who use substances. Challenge and dismantle gender norms that promote the sexualization of girls and women. Encourage youth leadership and program planning and other initiatives. We also want you to know that sensationalizing the problem is really problematic, and it makes it worse. I'm sure that we've all seen posters and media campaigns depicting people in chains, tied to a bed or in a cage. While on the one hand, yes, we have spoken to people who had these experiences, but the vast majority of people did not have experiences like this. Sadly, it is not this black and white with coercion and interpersonal violence. It is much more insidious, and often people who have been trafficked see themselves in a relationship with the person who is exploiting them. So they would see these campaigns and not feel like the supports offered are applicable to them. This point extends beyond just the women in chains narrative. We've heard from people with lived experience that their own experiences often do not line up perfectly with any single definition of human trafficking in general. So by sensationalizing the issue, people who really could use the support are invisible, and they don't think that they deserve help because their own experience is not that bad. Sort of like, well, I'm not in chains, so I guess I'm not being trafficked, or no one can really help me. I can also tell you from my years of experience in working in gender-based violence that nearly every single person in dangerous and violent intimate partner relationships, they minimize the lethality of their own experience. Sensationalizing it silences and encourages people who actually remain in these dangerous situations. It does the opposite of what we hope it will achieve. If I were to be honest, I think that these sensationalized images are created so that we, the general public, care about the issue. Meanwhile, it's only harming those that we want to help. So instead, maybe share some meaningful messaging that doesn't sensationalize. The poster here is one that our team developed, and that can be shared from our website or our Facebook page. Finally, we also want you to know about the harm of sex work stigma. As I mentioned before, human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation is essentially violence, coercion, and exploitation in sex work. There's a huge stigma surrounding anyone working in the sex industry. Even those who consent and choose to work in sex work are routinely subjected to discrimination. Sadly, traffickers exploit this stigma. We've heard people with lived experience say that traffickers told them, no one will care because you're a sex worker, or no one will believe you because you just have sex for money. When we as a society perpetuate stigma and shame against those in the sex industry, we're playing right into the hands of the traffickers, and we risk isolating people from possible supports. It pushes trafficking further underground where more violence and coercion can happen. So please untangle your own sex work stigma. Connecting and supporting with the work of local sex work alliances like SWANS, the Sex Work Advocacy Network of Sudbury. Acknowledge that sex work is real work, and press for the decriminalization of prostitution. For more information and to see some of our other webinars that we've created, policy briefs and academic papers as a part of this project, please check out our website, www.norat.nipissingU.ca. Thank you and miigwech for your time and interest in this issue.